intolerance that may lead to group-targeted violence. The date marks the anniversary of the liberation of the Nazi concentration and extermination camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau on January 27, 1945. Our first survivor is Anita Weisbord. Anita was born in Vienna, experienced Germany annexing Austria, and was sent on the Kindertransport to England as a child.
My name is Anita Weisbord. I was born in Vienna, Austria. I was the youngest of three. I had a wonderful childhood. Everything a child needs: loving parents, brother and sister, lot of aunts and uncles and friends. And everything changed when Hitler marched into Austria, which was March the 13th, 1938. Right overnight, you become a non-person. They were marching on the street and chanting, Hitler awake, Jude verrecke. That means Hitler awake, Jews perish. That was the end of my childhood, the way I knew it. Jews lived in Austria for hundreds of years. They lived very well. They were pillars of the community. And just overnight, everything changed. I had a girlfriend living next door. She was Catholic, I was Jewish. There was never any difference. I used to be in her house, decorating a Christmas tree. She liked to be in my house, having matzo ball soup. There was never any difference. But after Hitler marched into Austria, she was afraid to talk to me. If somebody will see her being together with me, they can denounce her and she would be arrested. So she was afraid to even talk to me. That was very sad. Now, my mother realized then they came Crystal Night, the night of the broken glass, November 9th and 10th, 1938. They burned most synagogues in Vienna, except one they couldn't burn because it was in a very narrow street and attached to a house. They were afraid the whole block might burn. So they used that synagogue as a stable for the horses. My mother realized that she has to save her children. My brother, who was already in the early 20s, his so-called friends were going to come for him. So he went illegally to France. He was in Paris. Now, in Europe, you needed identity papers. He had none. So one day, the French police stopped him and asked for papers. As he had none, they were going to send him back. You can just imagine what would happen to him when they send him back. So he joined the French Foreign Legion and ended up in Africa. Now, right after Crystal Night, after burning all the synagogues, arresting thousands of men, taking them to concentration camp, they came into our apartment, arrested my father, who ended up in Dachau concentration camp, smashed some furniture, and took whatever they wanted. Now, you would think you called the police. You couldn't. There were one of them. There was absolutely nothing you can do. My sister and I were only afraid they shouldn't hurt my mother. Now, Hitler waited. How will the world react? What happened to Crystal Night? But the world was quiet. So Hitler knew he could do what he wanted to do. But there was one country who had some compassion, and that was England. Right after Crystal Night, They had a debate in Parliament. What could they do? They decided to take in an unspecified number of children. They had to be under 17 years of age, and that was called the Kindertransport. April the 2nd, the first arrived in England until August, just before war broke out. 10,000 children were saved. 90% of all those children never saw their parents again. I remember my mother and my aunt had 4 children, having a violent argument. My aunt called my mother a rotten mother. How can you send your children away? How can you do that? Do you know, until I became a mother, did I realize they were both right. What does a mother want to do? What does your mother want to do? Hold you close. Right? That's what mothers do. But I truly believe my mother gave birth to me twice. When I was born, and when she had the strength and the foresight to send me out on the Kindertransport. Now, you know, it is very hard for young people to realize what happened. Today, with internet and television, you know what happens in the world instantly. We didn't have that in 1938. I had no idea where England was. As far as I'm concerned, it could have been outer space. Never met an English person. So it was very scary knowing to go into a foreign country. You don't know the language. You don't know who's going to take care of you. It was very scary. I remember the day I left. That was March the 13th, 1939. I only remember the date because it was the 1-year anniversary of Hitler marching into Austria. There was jubilation, and I remember being in the railway station. I'm inside the train. My mother is outside. For 4 agonizing hours, the train stood there. I'm inside, my mother outside. I was afraid to step away from the window because I thought I might lose her forever. You know, that's over 80 years ago. And to this day, I cannot stand anybody seeing me off. It left that impression on me. I don't remember how many children we were on the train, but there were little ones, 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, who had no idea what happened to them. They just cried for their mothers. And if somebody survived, they all grew up in England as nice English boys and girls. And if somebody survived and came for them, they couldn't even remember them. They were too young. I was 15. I knew who I was, and we all took care of the little ones on the journey. We went through Germany, came to the border of Holland. The German came in, opened up suitcases. We only allowed to take a small suitcase, only personal belongings, nothing of value. They opened some suitcases and yelled at us. If anybody smuggled anything, back you go. But nothing happened. And we went over the border to Holland, where we felt free. There were ladies on the platform who gave us hot chocolate and sandwiches. That was the first time I ever saw white bread. It was very funny feeling. We felt free. We felt like we're going on an adventure, but we were all scared stiff. What's going to happen to us? Who's going to take care of us? Not knowing the language. It was a very scary time.
Thank you, Anita. Also, for all of you out there watching, the picture behind Anita was the experience, the nightmare that she witnessed as a 15-year-old. Our next survivor is Renee Silver, who was born in the German state of Saarland. During the Holocaust, Renee and her sister were hidden in the Protestant community of Le Chambon, France. The picture above Renee are the heroes that saved her, Magda and Andre Trocame.
The Holocaust was a descent into hell in which millions perished in acts aided and abetted by millions, not only in Germany, but in countries defeated and annexed by the Germans, and even in countries far removed, such as the United States, who refused to hear the cries of despair and offer asylum. Yet, there were those who had the courage to care, despite, in many cases, the danger to their own lives or the lives of their families. In 1945, at war's end, my immediate family, mother, father, little sister, and I slowly realized that we were the only survivors in Europe. Some family members had emigrated to Brazil and the United States before the war. The rest, my grandfather, my uncles and aunts, cousins of both parents, were exterminated in concentration camps. How did the four of us survive? When France was divided, after being defeated into occupied and unoccupied France, we found ourselves in Villeurbanne, just outside the city of Lyon, in occupied France. This was also known as Vichy France, as the town of Vichy was its capital, under the leadership of the aging Maréchal Philippe Pétain. Pétain's first official act was to create a special ministry to deal with la question juive, the Jewish question. And Pierre Laval, a virulent anti-Semite, was put in charge of this ministry. Armies of lawyers went to work to determine who was a Jew and in which ways Jews would be dealt with. Jews were no longer allowed into certain restaurants, parks, public places, etc. They could not attend the special schools for the gifted. Medicine, engineering, and law were closed to them. Concentration camps sprang up throughout France. While they were not extermination camps, they were portals to such extermination camps. French police rounded up the Jews, French military guarded them, and French railroads transported them to the extermination camps in the East. When these new edicts became the law of the land, there were a few who stood up and expressed their humanity. The pastor of a small Huguenot community in the Massif Central was one of these giants. André Trocmé was a pacifist. As soon as the new laws were proclaimed, he preached a sermon outside of his temple in Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, where In his sonorous voice, he proclaimed, "We shall fight. We shall fight with the weapons of the Spirit." He galvanized not only his immediate flock of parishioners, but with the help of like-minded religious leaders and teachers in the region, enabled a network of rescuers. Some 2,500 people saved the lives of some 5,000 Jewish children and young people. The area where this occurred is somewhat cut off from the rest of France. At the end of the 15th century, during the war between Catholics and Protestants, many Protestants fled France and many settled on this land to reach plateau in southern France. They were called Huguenots. In 1942, these Huguenots, these Protestants, as well as other Christians in the region, defied the new French laws, risking their own lives and the lives of their families. They were sincerely religious, conscious of the sanctity of human life. They followed the laws of the Old Testament, and often the code word for a Jew was an Old Testament. My little sister, then 9, and I, 11, were saved by these when we were taken to Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, although we were too young to even know why we were there. We thought we were going to the mountains and did not really understand that we were being hidden until it became apparent that we would be separated, and were told that we could not write to my parents or receive mail. During the same period, my parents' lives were saved by the action of individuals who acted entirely on their own. My best friend was Renée Cossidière. Her parents were the janitors of a large municipal complex in Villeurbanne where we lived. The complex housed a municipal clinic, a municipal theater, a municipal swimming pool, municipal offices, and Monsieur and Madame Cossidière, my friend's parents, were the janitors of that complex. In July 1942, the municipal offices of that complex were used to house the Pétain police, which were the counterpart of the Gestapo. And they were in charge of rounding up the Jews in what was the French called rafle, which means raids. One morning, Monsieur Cossidière, who shared the bathroom with these members of the Pétain police, overheard them gleefully say to each other and beating their breasts, "Tonight's the night we're going to get them all." These raids usually took place at night when people were home. He knew exactly what to do. He knew exactly what this meant. While he had never met my parents, he knew I was Jewish, and he knew where I lived. He immediately went over to see my parents, ring their bell, and explain to them the purpose of his visit. My parents understood perfectly and did not hesitate, followed him to his little apartment under the very noses of the people who were set to arrest them. That very night, from the window of the Cossidière's apartment, my parents watched as their friends, neighbors, and acquaintances were being loaded onto trucks and buses, taking them away. The Cossidières had no church affiliation. They were simply good human beings who recognized their opportunity to save two other human beings' lives. Had they hesitated or deliberated, it would have been too late. I would like to add that my father was totally paralyzed on the left side of his body from a World War I injury to the brain, and could not have survived one day in a concentration camp. My mother could not survive seeing him suffer. Le Chambon-sur-Lignon is a unique place where members of different Christian faiths, inspired by Pastor André Trocmé, protected, hid, and saved a large number of Jewish children. The Quakers, people like Werner Wright, members of the Unitarian Universalists helped. In other parts of France, individuals of the Catholic Church saved numerous lives, creating baptismal certificates and new identities for Jewish children. The distance between the commission of evil and the willingness to turn away and ignore it is not very great in the eyes of the just. To pretend it doesn't or didn't exist is evil too. We are all members of the human race and responsible for each other. Over the temple of the Le Chambon-sur-Lignon are inscribed the words, Aimez-vous les uns les autres. Love one another. I would like to finish by quoting the words of the late Elie Wiesel. Remember that it is easy to save human lives. One did not need to be heroic or crazy to feel pity for an abandoned child. It was enough to open a door, to throw a piece of bread, a shirt, a coin. It was enough to feel compassion. In those times, one climbed to the summit of humanity by simply remaining human.
Thank you, Renee.
Thank you, Renee. Also, to let all of you know, we are very excited. Next month, Anita, our first survivor, will be turning 99 years old. Renee will be turning 91 years old. And we're excited Werner Wright will be turning 94 years old. Our final survivor is Werner Wright. Werner and his family were residents of Berlin, Germany when the Nazis came to power. After 2 years in the concentration camp, Werner was sent on the death march.
You're on.
Hello. When I was 15 years old, I was arrested in Yugoslavia strictly because I was a Jew. And for the next 2 years, I spent time in concentration camps. I was taking care of horses. I was digging up turnips. I was leveling ground. I was involved in all different types of work. I was wearing a striped uniform while I was in Auschwitz. I got my arm tattooed, and all this strictly because I was Jewish. In the meantime, Germany had a war with Russia, and Russia started to gain ground. And in January 1945, most of the concentration camps, which were situated in Poland and other eastern part of Europe, were emptied by the German military, by the SS. The SS themselves were put into the army, And the prisoners were moved from Eastern Europe to Germany and to camps like Bergen-Belsen and Mauthausen and some other camps. And what happened was that these camps got overcrowded and there was no food there was no supervision, and people died by the thousands. Now, obviously, to get from Poland to some of these other camps, you had to travel. And the way of travel was called at that time a death march. And I was involved in a death march like that. And most of the people who were involved with me died. We were given on, I think it was January 19th, 1945, we were given a piece of bread and we were told to start marching. There were 60,000 of us. The temperature was way, way below zero. And as you walked, we walked for maybe an hour or two. People stopped and sat on the ground, and they froze to the ground. And when we got up, you tore the clothing. People who couldn't get up were shot by the military. We walked for a couple of hours and then we stopped. And the first day we sort of could take it. We were loaded into, we were ended up in a sort of old stables, and we spent the night there, and the next day we continued. We had absolutely no food. We had a slice of bread before we started walking, and we put it into our pockets of the jackets, and the bread froze and we couldn't eat it. We continued like that, and the second day we ended up at a farm that had a huge concrete platform, and we were told to lie down on this. You haven't lived until you've slept on a piece of ice called concrete. In the middle of the night, we were told to turn over to the other side. So not only one side was cold, then the other side. And this was outside in the fresh air. It was absolutely horrifying. And then we continued on the third day. We continued, and by this time, people were dying in large, large groups. They were falling down or they were shot, whatever. We continued like that until we arrived at the railroad siding. And there were open railroad cars, wide open railroad cars, the ones you used for carrying coal or lumber. And we were loaded into these open railroad cars. And the cars started to move. It was unbelievably cold. The wind was blowing on us, and obviously we were thinking of escaping, but there was no way we could escape because atop these railroad cars, there were young boys, 14-year-old boys and 60-year-old men who were drawn into the army, and they had guns and they would shoot. And we traveled like that for 4 days. I can distinctly recall the first day and a half. And afterwards, I can't remember what happened. I must have passed out. I must have been freezing, whatever. It was so unbelievably cold that I can't remember anything that happened. And after the fourth day, we arrived in Mauthausen, Austria, and there was a big concentration camp. Most of the people in the cars died. They're dead by that time. And we were herded, those of us who were still alive were herded from the railroad cars into the barracks of that camp. And I couldn't walk properly. And most of the other people couldn't walk because our feet were frozen. It was like walking on eggs. And eventually we ended up in the camp and we were showered. And obviously the feet defrosted, and it was the most excruciating pain I ever experienced in my life. And at that point, hell really started, the worst part of my time in the concentration camp, because there was no food there and my feet started to rot. There was a prisoner of war who was from Yugoslavia, and he was a doctor before the war. And without any anesthetic or without anything, he cut off my toes on one foot and part of the toes on the other foot. And then he bandaged it up in paper. And that's all he had. He had no medication. He had no nothing whatsoever. And I was lying there, and my feet were festering. And there was no food there. We ended up getting a tablespoon of moldy bread a day. There were corpses all over the place. There were thousands upon thousands of dead bodies. And they just lay there, and they were just rotting. And we were in between. Sometimes I hear people talking about concentration camps, and I hear them joking about the camps and making fun. The concentration camps were not fun. They were the worst horrible horror that you can imagine. And if you saw pictures of it, you would vomit. We were lying there amongst corpses. There were huge piles of dead bodies. And these piles were slightly moving because some of the people were still breathing a little bit. They were not all dead, but to all purpose, these people were not alive anymore. And then we were liberated on the 5th of May, 2 days before the end of the war. And the American soldiers had, we were liberated by Americans, and they had absolutely no food. They didn't even know that there was a concentration camp there. So they gave us military rations. And we ate these military rations, and thousands of people died eating them. We stayed on. We were smelling to high heaven. We haven't washed or bathed in 5 months. We had the same uniform on, the one which we had in Auschwitz, the one in which we left. So we were wearing the same uniform for 5 months. We were lying in our feces. We were dirty, filthy, and the American soldiers didn't want to really touch us, but they had to wash us. Most people there couldn't even stand. We were so weak. When I was liberated, I was 17 years old and I weighed 64 pounds. That's it. And I stayed another few more weeks and ended up traveling back home from where I started from. Now, many people are asking, could the Holocaust been prevented? Remember, there are 12 million people were murdered under the Holocaust. There were not only Jews, there were gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, gay people, all the people that Hitler and his buddies did not like. So the question is, could it somehow have been prevented? And the answer is yes. If the people would have opened their mouth, if they would have objected to what was happening, if all of them got together, the Holocaust could have been prevented. But nobody said a word. Nobody said anything. I think the best way to solve this problem is thinking of the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, who said, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And I say to you, when you see somebody who is in need, when you see somebody who is being bullied, when you see somebody who needs help, open your mouth. You're not little children. You have the brains and the wisdom to help. So help them. Please, don't be a bystander. Be a friend who speaks. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like to learn more about our virtual and in-person programs, please visit us at www.hmtcli.org. In closing, I'd like to also quote the survivor, the late Elie Wiesel. The opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. That means the opposite of education is not ignorance, it is indifference. The opposite of beauty is not ugliness, but indifference. The opposite of life is not death, but indifference. Indifference to life and death. So whatever you do in your life, indifference is never an option. Indifference is never the beginning of a process. It's the end of a process. We all have a responsibility to combat injustice by not being indifferent. Thank you very much.